Hello everyone and welcome back to the channel. Sorry for the wait. I know we haven't published anything for a long time, but I've been thinking actually about making this video for quite some time because this is still so this is still not a recipe video. Sorry about that. There's going to be one coming up soon, but I really feel we need to go over some of the typical baking equipment I'm going to cover in that first video before we get started. So this is going to be a pretty long video. I mean, I'm going to cover a lot of different things around like baking sheets, baking mats, parchment paper, plastic film, all of the tools that you need to make French pastries. I'm also going to keep talking about the difference between French baking and American baking. As you can see on the back side here, you have what we call pie rings and cake rings that you might not be familiar with, but this is the base of everything you're going to need on this channel. And this is what they actually gave us on our first day of pastry school. This is kind of the base of the utensils that we are going to need. These are not really hard to find in the US. It's slightly more expensive than it is in Europe, but this is possible to get. Like one good pie ring like this is probably about $10 or $15 maybe, and you just need one to get started. So it's not that much of a problem. I'm also going, in this video, I'm also going to keep talking about the difference between home baking and commercial baking. The goal here, and not just in video, but in general on this channel, before going to pastry school, I was a home baker. Then I went to pastry school, and then I did some internships in some pastry shops in Paris. So I've been able to see both sides of the coin and see what people did in a commercial setting. And the goal here is not to make you buy some expensive, fancy equipment or like a 100 quart freestanding mixer or like a walk-in rotating oven. But basically, I'm trying to bring all of the tools and technique from commercial baking that are still applicable to home baker. And the thing is that what I realized is that most of the time, it's actually not more expensive. It might be less to get something that is sturdy and professional, that will last you a long time, rather than something that is more for form than function. And I'm going to cover a lot of different tools here, and I will tell you what I consider to be must-haves versus like nice to have. Just to make sure like we're not trying to oversell anything here. And I'm going to tell you exactly what, for instance, the pastry school in my case gave us on day one. Like what do you need to make an apple pie, or what do you need to make an entremet, and things like this. So first things first. I'm going to start with baking sheets, and I have a lot of different styles here. And overall, I would say nowadays, myself, I only use two types, but I quickly want to go over some of the things that I bought originally when I got started, and finally how I just narrow it down to what's important and what works 90% of the time. So I'm also going to tell you when it is important to invest a little bit more money for quality and when it's not. So let's get started with the most basic type of baking sheet you might have. So this is an aluminum baking sheet. It is very thin. And one of the main problems, I mean, it has some, it's almost edgeless, which is actually a good thing. I'll get back to that in a minute. But the main problem with this type of baking sheets, and I don't use that anymore at all, is that it tends to warp. As you can see, I'm going to try to not mess up with focus, but if you you can easily bend it. And this might not be a problem. Let's say if you're baking individual cookies or something that doesn't need to stay flat. But let's say you're baking like a sponge cake with one of those rings. Let me grab one. And if it's not completely flat, the ring is not going to be flush with the baking sheet, and all of your cake batter is going to basically leak out. So it is very important, like when you pick one of those up at a store, just try to bend it a little bit, and if it warps too much, just don't get it. Like, it's not worth it. I would rather spend a few extra dollars to get something a little bit more sturdy. So next one up is something a little bit similar, but it's a little bit thicker, and even like I can maybe warp it a little bit, but it's a lot more sturdy. So when I say warping, what I mean by that is that usually under high heat, the metal will warp, obviously. So in the oven, you can note, I mean, you've probably noticed that, like, sometimes you place the baking sheet on one of your racks, and then like one of the edge will lift up because the sheet just basically warps under high heat. So this one is a little bit thicker, and so it's a little bit better in that sense. But there's even better. So this one, much thicker, full aluminum. This brand I like, it's Vollrath. I should probably mention some of the brands that I like because it's usually a sign of quality. But as you can see, I think this is like 18 gauge aluminum, very sturdy, impossible to warp, and ageless. So it's pretty good. So if you want an edgeless sheet, I would recommend this one. Unfortunately, right now they're sold out on Amazon. And some third-party sellers sell it for very high price. But you can probably get one of those Vollrath sheet for $20, $20 to $30, and it's definitely worth the price, in my opinion. Next up, we have some more typical baking sheets that you probably recognize, like in 90% of the case, when you go to a kitchen store, or even if you type just a baking sheet or cookie sheet on Amazon, what you will see is something that looks like this. So it's something with very high edges or borders, I don't know. And I personally don't like this type of pan. Like, for one reason, this type of sheets is under heat, so basically in the oven, the baking sheet is going to get very hot, obviously, including the sides, right? This is metal, and so you're going to have radiant heat basically coming out of the sides, here, here, and here. And so if you have some cookies all over your sheet, or a macaron, or whatever, you've probably noticed that all of the edges are going to get more cooked, or they're going to brown faster. And this is a problem. You want to make sure that whatever you make, what's in the middle and what's on the side, actually gets the same amount of heat. And unfortunately, with these pans with high edges, you're going to run into over baking issues or under baking issues. Like, if you try to stop the cooking process before the sides get brown, well, probably whatever you bake in the center is going to be underbaked. So I very much prefer like edgeless baking sheets, like this one, so you don't run into the same issue with this, because there's no radiant heat coming off the sides than something like this, right? The thing is, one of the actual benefit of having these edges is that it doesn't warp as much because the edges actually give more rigidity to the structure, and this is why they add the edges most of the time. But as long as you get something that is high quality and high gauge thickness, even without edges, it's almost impossible to warp. Now, there is an intermediate solution between like the full-on, almost like 1-inch edge and then the edgeless. And this is something that is like this. So very shallow edge for rigidity. So it doesn't warp, but it's shallow enough and flared out so that the radiant heat from the side doesn't actually overbake whatever is on the outside. This is from a French brand called De Buyer, and this is actually you can find this on online, on specialty online stores or even on Amazon for about, I would say, $30. But I mean, nowadays I've discovered this type of products in pastry school. I had never used that before, and even when I was doing my internships, this is what commercial bakers use in France, and I use exclusively this now. There's another type of baking sheet that you can use for some application, and it's exactly the same profile as this one, except that if you don't need the non-stick properties of your sheet, you can go with a perforated one. So it's exactly the same profile with a shallow edge, and then having a perforated surface makes it easier for obviously heat to heat up the bottom of whatever you're trying to bake. Obviously, don't use this with anything that is runny or macaron or whatever, but for baked goods like bread or and I'm going to tell you in a minute about like baking mats, this is actually quite useful to make sure air can circulate. Now, that's it for baking sheet. Now I'm going to talk about baking mats. So a little bit of a pro tip: if the only pans that you have are these more traditional pans with tall sides, and you have a bunch of them and they're good quality, they're not warped, don't go and buy some of the others that I recommend. One of the things that you can do to prevent the radiant heat from coming to the side is very simple. Just flip it. So when you bake your stuff, when you put it on the rack in the oven, you just flip it, and you can put your baking mat on top, and then you have all the benefit of a high rigidity baking sheet without the drawback of having radiant heat coming off the sides. So quick tip, you can still use your more traditional pans, but I recommend actually flipping them upside down and putting your baking mat directly on top, and you're good to go. No need to buy anything else. Baking mats now. Earlier I briefly talked about some brands that I've tried both in France and the US, and some that I recommend. So I just want to quickly go over some of those brand names. In terms of French brands, there are, I would say, two major brands that are used across the industry. One is De Buyer, and the other one is Matfer. There's also a third one that is a bit less known but does very high quality product. It's Malard Ferrière. But I would say De Buyer and Matfer are like very well-known, reputable brands that are used by chefs, not just in France, but all over the world. And some of those products are available in the US at a little bit of a higher price tag, obviously, because it's imported. But I've also tried some American brands that I like a lot, and I wanted to give them a shout out because they make some amazing products. One is Volrath. It's used across the industry. It's very sturdy, unbreakable, high quality. I think that this pan for this cookie sheet, for instance, is a Volrath. This is indestructible. This is very, very high quality. So I would, if you have a hard time finding those French brands, the Debuyer or Matfer, you can look up Volrath. The second one is USA Pan. I don't have any USA Pan sheets here, but I have some of their loaf pans, and they're amazing. They're some of my favorite loaf pans. So USA Pan, you can see it at the bottom. Super high quality product. Again, I mean, look at you can tell, like, from the build quality is amazing. It's very affordable. And you can find some good discounts online if you shop on commercial websites. All right, that being said, so we covered the baking sheets, cookie sheets. I wanted to talk about some of the baking mats. So I would say over the past maybe 20 years, something that's been a little bit of a revolution in the baking world is the use of silicone mats. And there are a lot of different types. I think one of the first brand that made some is called De Marle. So that's the brand name, and that's the name of their product is called Silpat. And now it's been like copied, and it's made by everyone now, and you can find it like very inexpensive online. Even Amazon makes one. Amazon Basics has a lot of these silicone mats. And they're very useful because you don't need to use as much parchment paper, and it's non-stick, easy to clean, there's no mess, and it's very, very useful. I recommend getting like 3 or 4 if you can. I think the Amazon one are fairly inexpensive, and you can get they have like packs of 2, and it's I use it for everything, pretty much. It's especially useful when you use a perforated mat. So if you want to make sure that that air goes through, but if you have some batter, you don't want that to go through, you can use a silicone mat for insulation, right? And something else that I've started using after going to pastry school is what we call an air mat. It's basically a silicone mat that is completely perforated. So it's like a ventilated silicone mat. So this is a Silicomart brand. This is a Debuyer brand. And it's very useful for a lot of different applications. And in the next video I'm going to make a pie. I'm going to use these air mats because and these pie rings that I'm going to talk about that in a minute. But basically, using an air mat like this and a pie ring on top basically prevents bubbling. Like, you don't need to use pie weights. You don't need to basically dock your dough before, or like poke holes in the dough to make sure that there's no bubble forming at the bottom and ruining your pie crust. But if you use like a perforated mat and also like a perforated baking sheet, all of the air that's going to build up at the bottom of your pie crust is going to come out of the bottom. So it saves you a lot of time, a lot of prep work. No need to buy like pie weights, as I mentioned. Just get some perforated silicone mat and you're good to go. So that's it for silicone mat. So the next thing I want to talk about is parchment paper. I'm still using parchment paper for some applications. However, something that I brought from my experience in pastry school and commercial baking, and something that I think everybody should do is to actually stop using rolls of parchment papers. We all know the problem with rolls. I mean, the only benefit of using a roll is that you actually get the length that you want, but it just curls up. It's difficult to keep in place, and it's always a bit of a mess. So instead, we're like, what do we use in a commercial kitchen? In a commercial kitchen, we don't use parchment paper because we don't have time to simply like roll it out and cut it to size and so on. So what do we use instead are parchment sheets, and they're stored flat. So it takes up maybe a little bit more room for sure in your kitchen, but you can easily store that flat in a drawer, and it's a lot easier to use. So basically, what you do is you have your baking sheet here, for instance, and you're ready to prepare something. You just pull out a sheet like that, and voila, that's it. And it's already cut to size. There's no mess, and it's not curling or anything. So I highly recommend getting some. Unfortunately, you have to buy this online, but you can find this on Amazon for cheap. It's exactly the same paper. I mean, you can get it white, you can get it brown. It's exactly the same material, except that it's already pre-cut to size and it's stored flat, so it doesn't curl. Next is plastic film. So whether it's in school or in a commercial kitchen, like we use plastic film all the time. And one of the big also difference between cooking or baking at home is that, unfortunately, in typical supermarket, whether it's in France or in the US, a typical roll of plastic film is actually quite short. It's about a foot long, and it might be good enough for most applications, but unfortunately, and I'm sure you've experienced that already, sometimes you have like maybe a large salad bowl or a large plate like this, and you're trying to cover it with some plastic film, and it's just simply not wide enough to cover everything. And so you have to cover one half and then the second half, and it's a mess, right? So here what I got is a food service plastic roll, and it's 18-inch long instead of 12. So obviously you can cover a much wider surface. It doesn't have to be in a dispenser like this. Like most of the time, people just take it out of the box and they use it as is. And one of the reasons why we need also wider rolls is because very often we might like prepare, let's say, some dough on a tray, and we need to completely wrap up the tray. And you can see that with a like a 12-inch roll, you're not going to be able to completely cover it side to side. And well, this is a French cookie sheet, and so it's even, so this is set in metric. This is about a foot long, but even you can imagine using the even bigger one like the Vol Wrap. It's impossible to cover with just a short one. So long story short, pun intended, I very much prefer the convenience, so using a much wider roll. You can get this about anywhere, even online on Amazon. It's 2,000 feet long, so it's probably going to last me 2-3 years. But at least I don't have to mess around with a much shorter roll. So if you have the room in your kitchen, I highly recommend getting something like this. It's much more convenient, and it ends up being a lot cheaper by the foot than something you can buy in a supermarket. One thing that I don't understand in particular is I've noticed that, let's say, so this is the Costco brand, but in other supermarkets, they have two different sizes for aluminum foil. They have the short one and then the long one, and it's available in supermarket for foil. But unfortunately, it's not for plastic film most of the time. If you want to get the longer version, you have to go to a specialty store or order online. So again, if you have the room, I recommend getting one. It's not a matter of budget because it actually ends up getting cheaper. It's more a matter of whether you have room to store this in your kitchen. And finally, before we move on to pie rings and cake rings, I just want to mention cooling racks. It's also very important. I recommend getting one or two. The ideal is to have a cooling racks that are the same size as your cookie sheets, baking sheets. And basically, why are cooling racks important? It's because after you're done baking something, and you take it out of the oven, the baking sheet is still very, very hot. If you leave whatever you baked on top, it's going to overbake. So as soon as you're done baking something, and it's one of the benefits also of having baking mats like this, is you can just pick it up and then transfer it to the cooling rack to let it cool and stop the baking process. Very, very important. We're going to do this many times on this channel, so I recommend getting one as well. All right, let's get down to business. For our next recipe, we're going to make a pie. And I would say one of the biggest difference between modern French pastry and French pies in that case, and American baking is how we bake pie crusts. So I don't have a lot of American style baking tools here, but let's say you might be used to shallow pans like this. So this is a glass one. You obviously have metal ones, but basically this is like a pan with a bottom. What we're going to use is actually this, a pie ring. This one is a basic one. I think it might be it's a de Buyer, 20 centimeters. If you want to, and it costs about like maybe $10. If you want a more fancy one, I recommend, and this is the one I use every time I make pies, but it's actually perforated, and it's the Buyer as well. Doesn't have to be that brand, but unfortunately, there's no real like American brands that make pie rings because, well, American baking doesn't use pie rings. So most of the pie rings you're going to find online, even in the US, are French brands. So either Mat Fer or de Buyer. And one of the reasons why I prefer the perforated one is exactly for the same reason we use perforated baking mat, sorry. It's to let any kind of air bubble between the pie crust and the ring to basically come out of the other side and prevents bubbling. So basically, instead of having a pan that is fully closed with the bottom and sides, we only use high quality baking sheet to make sure it doesn't warp. And then we just use a ring as you can think of it as just a scaffolding for your pie crust. And it's a lot easier to clean, to basically remove. It's kind of difficult to take out a pie from a dish like this because sometimes it sticks at the bottom and you have to make a mess of the pie to take it out. In the past, even in France, you might have seen things like this, where to solve the problem, they had removable bottoms where you would have the pie crust all around, and after it's cooked, then you just pop out the bottom and then take it out. But now, I mean, I said earlier, this is more kind of a modern trend, but you would never see anything like this in a French pastry shop anymore. This is very old-fashioned and old school. Nobody uses that anymore. We only use rings because with the combination of high quality baking sheets and perforated mats, you don't need to have a bottom to your pan. The bottom of the pan is the actual sheet itself, and then you just take that out. And the comparison between these two, between kind of the more traditional flooded version and the pie ring here, is exactly the same for individual tarts. So you can have like smaller individual things like this, which is again like a little bit more old-fashioned, and it's kind of, this one is not removable, so it's a little bit hard to take out. Instead, what we use is small tart rings. So this one is interesting because it's made of a different material. So it's not a metal ring, but it's also perforated. And it's exactly the same height. So for individual tarts, we use these type of rings. So again, this is not metal. This is made from a heat-resistant hard plastic called exoglass. It's very, very tough and very heat resistant. And again, it's just a ring used as a scaffolding for your little tarts. And because both the baking mat and the ring itself are perforated, you don't need to use pie weights or to make holes in the dough to prevent bubbling, because all the build-up steam is going to come out the other side. One of the benefits of all these new tools and utensils is that you can even get different shapes. You can have like squares or hearts or whatever diamond shape, and basically be more creative with your pastry if you want. So that's it for pie rings, and now I'm going to talk about cake rings. So cake rings. So for cake rings, we have exactly the same modern evolution that I talked about with the pies, with a few small differences. So as you can see, to make cakes on this channel, I mean, we're going to use this type of things a lot. So it's called a cake ring. It's about 2 inches tall, and this is what we're going to use to make entremets. We have different sizes. It's good in general to have 3 different sizes. There's usually like 2 centimeters difference between each ring. So I think this is 16, 18, and 20 centimeters. And again, these are in metric because these are French. This is again De Buyer, French brand. And most of the cake ring you can find in the US are also in metric because they're imported from Europe anyway. And we call that cake rings even when they're not rings, when they're squares. And this is fairly similar. So again, like the philosophy here is very similar to what I just mentioned about pie rings. Now that we have better tools and technology with these like non-stick sheets and silicone mat, there's really no need to have a bottom to your cake pans. There's no need to get a bottom. The bottom of the pan is the sheet itself. So you just need to have your cake ring on a high quality baking sheet and baking mat so it doesn't warp, to make sure that if it doesn't warp, like the cake batter is not going to leak out of the seam here. Now, you might ask the question like, why are these not perforated, for instance? Is that basically, it's because basically we use cake rings and mostly to cook liquid batter, like for instance a sponge cake. So here I'm going to use, for instance, a non-perforated silicone mat and a non-perforated cake ring. I mean, cake rings of this size, I don't think they even come as perforated because there's no application for it. And so you want to make sure that this is completely sealed. And after your, let's say your sponge cake has baked, you just have to lift this up and lift the baking mat, and then you're good to go. And it's exactly the same for any kind of shape. So if you wanted to make a square cake, well, instead of using a typical cake pan like this with edges and bottom, we just use a bottomless cake ring that is square. And that's about it. I think that's it for today. I think I've covered everything I wanted to cover to give you all the explanations for the first the next few recipes, where I'm going to start with pies, because this is actually literally the first thing that we've learned in pastry school on day one. And I'm going to be using a perforated pie ring to make a pie crust. So next up, we're going to have a video on how to make a shortbread pie crust. And then the application would be a pear tart, and then a French apple pie, and a lemon meringue pie. If you enjoyed the channel, remember to click like and subscribe. I will try to put some links and references to all these equipments that I found in the US in the comments down below. Some of the links are affiliated links that you can use if you want to help the channel. I'm not going to be a millionaire anytime soon with those links. And but some others are just other websites. When those items can't be found on Amazon, I'll give you links on where you can find it elsewhere, whether it's because it's not available on Amazon or I found it cheaper elsewhere. So looking forward to see you next time, and I hope you enjoy the channel.